Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski, and what I wanted to do was to create a video in which we talk about rhetoric, because the first part of our class is going to focus on rhetoric and argument. And so, what I wanted to do was just kind of create a short lecture in which we talk about rhetoric and argument. And I think that'll help us set the tone for the first part of the class. The one thing you should know is that students love the rhetoric and argument part of class. It is always fun. So I think we have to first off start off our class is asking, what is rhetoric? And I want you to know that I can ask this question in a ground class, and generally sometimes my students generally have kind of three reactions. Sometimes students admit that they've never heard the term rhetoric before. So if you're in that place, it's normal, because sometimes students admit, hey, they've never heard the term rhetoric. Now, other times students have said that they've heard the term rhetoric, but they have no idea what it means. So it's hard for them to come up with a definition. And then finally, I kind of get a third group of students who are able to define a definition of rhetoric, but they're not sure what it means. So before we can go down into more of a deeper analysis of rhetoric, what I want to do is break down rhetoric into three parts. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down rhetoric into three parts. First, we're going to have to figure out who are the people who use rhetoric. Then we're going to talk about forms of rhetoric. And then we'll finally be able to come up with some sort of definition of rhetoric. So I think it's safe to say, because oftentimes students say they've never heard the term rhetoric, I think the first thing we have to all agree on is that we know that there are certain people who use rhetoric, and we got to figure out who these people are, because even if we have no idea what the term rhetoric means, it's safe to say that there are certain groups that use rhetoric. And so the first group that students can always associate with rhetoric, whether it's in a ground class and an online class, is students can always associate politicians with rhetoric. And so if you think about it, in the course of the last few years, you may have heard something saying like, Donald Trump is using rhetoric, or Joe Biden is using rhetoric. Again, we have no idea what that term means, but we know that the word rhetoric is often associated with politicians. Now, the second group that students can always associate with rhetoric is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because there is our link to how rhetoric and argument can be connected. Because if you think about what do lawyers do, they're paid to make arguments, right? Lawyers always argue for a certain cause. So it makes sense that students would always associate lawyers with rhetoric. And so we might talk about what other groups we can think about use rhetoric. And these are some of the ideas that students come up with, right? Oftentimes students say, well, philosophers use rhetoric. And so if you think about it, oftentimes, Socrates or Aristotle are associated with rhetoric. Students can often associate writers with use rhetoric. And then they always say, hey, teachers like to use rhetoric. So let's not include, if we're going to say that teachers use rhetoric, that students use rhetoric all the time. And sometimes they're not very good at it. So if you think about what we've done here, is we've just talked about the people who use rhetoric. We talk about politicians, lawyers, philosophers, writers, teachers, and students. So then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. What might be a form of rhetoric? And that's why I always like to use the example of a politician, right? That politicians are associated with rhetoric. And so sometimes I used to always ask students, let's imagine that I'm going to have a guest speaker come into class, and I'm going to have a guest speaker come to class, and that speaker is going to be former President Barack Obama. So for Barack Obama, we're standing in front of the class, we know he uses rhetoric. What is he doing? And students will say, well, things like he's talking, he's using words, and then someone will say, well, he's giving a speech. So a classic form of rhetoric is generally a speech, right? And so then I always ask, well, how many people may have heard Barack Obama give a speech? And sometimes students raise their hands and sometimes they don't. Or I say, well, how is it possible that you would have heard Barack Obama give a speech without seeing live in person? And they'll say things like TV. So notice TV can be a form of rhetoric. If TV can be a form of rhetoric, then so can radio, the internet, right? If we associate writers with rhetoric, then we can talk about a book being a book being a form of rhetoric. If writers use rhetoric, a form of rhetoric might be a newspaper. So we might call that person a journalist, email, social media. But these are all just examples of forms of rhetoric. So once we've established that there are people who use rhetoric and that we have forms of rhetoric, then we can start to define rhetoric. I'm going to define rhetoric for our class as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. And for the first couple of weeks, this is how I'm going to define the term rhetoric. And so now, after this kind of brief lecture, I've posted 2 other videos I'd like you to watch. And what I want you to do is I want to know, based on this lecture, the other 2 videos, how would you define rhetoric and why? You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, but for the start of week 1, I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And then I'll be curious and we'll have something to play with. I'm excited to see how you guys will define the term rhetoric.